Yes, I'm Jenni Pack. I don't represent any particular organisation. I have been a prison chaplain. I am a volunteer, as a volunteer in Queensland. I am a volunteer with the street chaplains, and also very interested in community things that help with the core problem of imprisonment, and that is at the family level. I notice that we've lost our backdrop here, which was referring to mother's love. And being Mother's Day on Sunday, and a couple of things that were going through my mind as I reflect on what I submitted last October, and then being asked to speak as just me. After that presentation by Mick Palmer, who has so much experience of that area that he addressed, the only thing that keeps me going now is that I come as a mother, and I come as a person who has sat with people in prison, sat with people on the streets, and know that the drug and alcohol problem is as a result of either the lack of being acknowledged or feeling any love, or perhaps being given a kind of indulgent love by, as we all are, imperfect parents, where they were allowed to get away with anything. I also noted with Mick Palmer's presentation about putting warnings about taking drugs, what the effects are and whatever. I mean, years ago, we put the warning on the cigarette packets, but I'm not sure if that's reduced. And I know as a mother, telling my children to step back from the edge of a cliff when we went bushwalking really didn't have any effect. So it's about, I suppose they're always going to take risks, and it's about listening to people. So just a summary of what I presented, that was what I said, that the problems that result in criminal activity are so complex that there are no simple solutions. And I know that the current judicial system attempts to put band-aids on the problem, and I welcome the opportunity that we have here as stakeholders to make submissions to be put to the government to try to reduce imprisonment and recidivism. The first, government support, I mean, there needs to be change, and I think that I'm not here to address the things that other people have addressed, and yet I have not been able to read the whole 358 pages of the draft. So just bear with me, I'll just present what I've got. There are some existing initiatives which I think government support or endorsement or promoting of them could have a beneficial outcome in preventing crime, because that's what I'm starting with. And I did mention in my submission what's been happening here in Townsville in the last year. Well, it's actually been worked on for more than that. But going to where Toowoomba 13 years ago tried to address the core issues which led to breakdown in society, and the initiative City Women was started 13 years ago, and it began with a self-esteem program for teenagers and girls, which has now been extended into programs being offered to both male and female teenagers in the 30 state schools in Toowoomba. It also includes pregnancy support network being established more recently into a citywide anti-pornography drive, which has been joined by the men of Toowoomba. So this initiative being picked up here, we're still struggling to get started, but it's like with anything, it's about a change of attitude, about where it all starts. The move against women being abused, yes, we can acknowledge men are abused too, but either way, you're destroying the roots of a new human being if they are being brought up by, or not being brought up, if they're just tumbling up in a home where there is no cohesion and there are too many social issues. The only thing I would add to the reviewing the current justice system was again not on the legislation slide, because I'll leave that to the experts. Although it has been noted that, as a chaplain, you could see that the justice system is so overworked that prisoners will spend sometimes years on remand, and as such they don't have access to programs, and in a lot of cases they have to complete these programs to be eligible for release. Doing the programs sure doesn't make it that they're going to be released and do any better, because sometimes these programs don't have any input in it. There's a book I've read by Rowena Solomon that since I've written my submission, and I tried to see if she is still practicing or whatever, but she has a lengthy experience in working with prisoners as an agency outside of the corrective system and working alongside of the corrective system, and saying that yes, unless the inmates have some input into what they need, what they think they need, we don't have any idea. The problem then is the bureaucracy and the red tape. I think her first experience was meeting with about 20 inmates to design what they felt would help them. And by the time it was all processed and rubber stamped, not one of the 20 was still in that facility. So it was starting from scratch with people who didn't necessarily want to be there, and so there were plenty of things fraught with disaster. At this point, I probably think, because we're talking about reducing the cost and having an effective justice system, I was privileged to be able to go, when I was still a chaplain, to the International Prison Chaplains Conference in 2015 in Sydney, where there were 300 delegates from all over the world, and they acknowledged, their part in the criminal justice system of the world, and mostly prison chaplains are volunteers. I know it does vary from state to state in Australia, and I know it does vary in other countries. Often they are remunerated by their religious body, if they are remunerated at all. But the point is, they've got their heart in it, and if they just give a few hours of their week, and it is well coordinated and they receive enough training, their contribution is invaluable, because they can give one-on-one time to inmates, and particularly the in-service. With this conference, we were able to see that which I'm suffering from today is just little old me, but it's one person can make a difference. One of the keynote speaker quite early in the piece put up a slide that famous saying, we all want to change the world, but not many of us want to start with us. And so it was about rethinking what we do, and under the, I suppose, the security of having been briefed and had our training and everything through the corrective system and through our agencies, being able to sit with prisoners once they're in there, and perhaps then we're trying to work out ways that we can follow them through, because the justice system doesn't really serve them. There's a 6-month transition where they're supposed to be getting ready before they go out, and then for 6 months after to be supported. But it's often prisoners go to court finally, and then they get sentenced, and it's time served, so they get released without any sort of assistance at all, stone cold. Have a friend who had to go to court to get released, and she'd served 14 years, and because of the situation, corrective services did try to find out where she would be released to, but for her own security, it wasn't made wasn't revealed particularly much, and that may be the reason that she had absolutely no support at all, save the volunteers within church bodies. So I think we need to regulate that, or the government needs to recognise it. I know they do, to a large extent. They do provide funding for prison chaplains in Queensland, and work very well, often come and give addresses, different people at the conferences. But I think what I got from the Sydney conference, international, was how it cannot be just like the icing on the cake or the extra thing that we can offer as a bit of a help, but that if people in chaplaincy or in support, like Rowena Solomon, who has her own company of counselling and consulting in drug and alcohol abuse, is able to work alongside the system and have more input, rather than, you provide this service and we'll give you this many dollars. So being able to make submissions like we are now, I guess. At the conference, we heard from three very successful countries as far as providing a criminal justice system. Sweden, we heard from Reverend Dr. Ulrika Fritzen, and she was employed by her religious body, I presume, but she was also studying, and the context of the work that she did in restorative justice program was done in Polesmore Prison in Cape Town. So there's this, not just, we will sort this ourselves, but looking, and she was actively involved from Sweden to South Africa, and it was a sort of a reciprocated thing. And her interest is to understand the philosophical way that what impact the meeting with victims has to offer the offender. And she's interested in the dynamic between the offender as a human being able to atone for the guilt and harm caused, and the point of reference for her work is relational philosophers, and lists them off. And so she started a reconciliation group in Sweden based on the restorative justice program that had been founded in Polesmore Prison in South Africa. And she found that the reconciliation group, it worked with cooperation from the Department of Corrective Services and the community, municipality being this little state part, and the Church of Sweden, and also private rehabilitation centres. So I think, as well as that, we that has to be addressed. And I did mention that in my submission, but I'm just me, so I don't really know what's current at the moment. Some of them are rehabilitation type and some are residential. The other system was Germany, and I saw a movie on that. So there's things that are accessible by people who have a little bit more facility to research than I have. the United States has been mentioned already by Mike Palmer, and I think that's what we tend to do. We tend to just copy their mistakes rather than thinking that we need to think differently. We need to change the way we look at things. And changing the way we look at things when you've got a big prison, and we're hearing of them needing to be extended, and so we can't spend any more money on pastoral care. But if we don't, and if we don't get to the roots of it, it'll just keep growing. So one of the suggestions, when I was saying about time served, so then prisoners get released after they've served, anything from a few months to sometimes they're not in long enough and so I really look forward to a review of, what is the law reforms, what is perhaps the decriminalisation of drugs, illicit drugs, and but if you get just time served, you haven't been able to address things like your driver's licence may have lapsed, and I'm talking now not the ones that came in off the streets. I'm talking the ones that could be fruitful, productive members of society. I've sat with women who have, been in prison for fraud, totally oblivious of the fact that they were committing the crime because of their focus on looking after their family. And that didn't realise they were conning the system. Or if they did, they chose to ignore it. But they can be productive members of society if they aren't released back. I mentioned one lady who I spent some time with. She came to prison here for driving without a licence, and repeatedly she not paying fines, so eventually she lost her licence. And she was just distraught because she had a disabled son who she didn't feel that she could just put him on a bus or even a taxi, possessive parenting, whatever you want to call it. That was her choice, even though it didn't make sense to drive without a licence. So then, of course, he had to go into care. Well, once she loses her accommodation, once she gets out of prison, and it may only be 4 months, she's lost her job, her home, and she would have to really fight to get a child back when she's got no home to take him to. And so it eventually costs the country even more than if there was another way of getting around the problem of she needing to get her son to work. So it's all a matter of, I suppose, getting the one-on-one, and how, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the coordination of volunteers, or just so we can get the manpower for the minimum dollar sign, I suppose, and to have them quality, being there because they want to make a difference, because they've been willing, I suppose, to go through all the training and come at it from a point of view of, sitting beside someone rather than, well, I'm going to fix you, which, is a tendency for all of us if we see a problem. Sure.
Help me understand the difference between, say, the prison psychologist and a chaplain. Are you able to distinguish the different way that you would work from a prison psychologist?
I just read the book by Rowena Sullivan that was published back in 2004, and I found what she was doing, she was going in as a professional psychologist, which obviously I wasn't, but she was also going in as, like I was, a mature woman who could have been the prisoner's mother or now even grandmother, and just listening to them. There's one state in the book where she said that she had listened to this man's talking about an incident that happened when he was 6 years old, where his mother had had a miscarriage, and he came home from school and she told him that he was to take the fetus out of the toilet and put it in the bin.
So that's obviously had a profound impact on his life and subsequent
Well,
events.
it didn't end there.
Right.
He knew at 6 years of age that you do not put a human being in a bin. So he buried it. And then the dog dug it up. So he got absolutely punished for not doing what he was told. And so this man had a life in prison and a life of self-mutilation.
And some links to that original.
And that's why my submission started with, we've got to do something in society. I mean, that poor woman would have been desperate. But it's the living in poverty. One of the things I would like to read out
Please.
from the International Prison Conference. This is a statement that they made, reiterated at the 2015, and they're every 5 years, so there's another one next year, and I can't remember where it is. What we repeat and turn the emphasis to be an inherent dignity of all prisoners, our particular concern for vulnerable prisoners, our commitment to work with others, including non-government organisations, world organisations and faith groups, to address poverty and facilitate access to food, clothing, medicines, literacy supplies needed in prison, and our advocacy of freedom of religion and for respect and resources for prison chaplains from all faith communities in their ministry of love and hope. Now, that's for those in prison. But the base of it is the lack of food, clothing, medicines and literacy supplies that causes them to go in. And you know, we've had politicians trying to address that for years. So I can't solve it, but I do see a growing need for governments to support other agencies to sow the seeds in the community. Some of the prison chaplain agencies, well, all of them try to have care on the inside, pastoral care, sitting with people, and then to follow that through, the same as the transitions officers. Now, the transitions officers, like some of them may be psychologists, some maybe not. So I've realised I really probably haven't answered your question completely. But, yeah, for safety reasons, often, you know, the prison chaplains are no longer able to do the follow-through care. So agencies try to have people from the outside in the last few months come and visit them. Well, it's the same problem as, you know, if you're on remand and you get released straight from prison. I mean, I've found out 3 or 4 days after someone I'd been visiting in prison had gone to court. It took me nearly a week to find out where she was. Fortunately, a solicitor had found her somewhere to stay. But we just need more agencies that can do that through care. And this psychologist, Rowena Solomon, I just couldn't believe some of the things that she was able to do. She sat there with this man telling this story, and then she could see that the sight of blood reminded him of the inflicting of wounds. So he was doing this to himself, and he actually said, as a grown man, I've got to do it to get the bad out. So we just need more psychologists like that at, you know, before it happens. But how I don't know.
Can we ask you some questions?
Sure, that's probably a good idea.
Jenny, I'm aware that were a prison chaplain from around 2008 to 2015, some 7 years, and you've talked quite at length about what's not happening, what's not working. If you could name, say, the top 3 things that are working, what would they be? For people who are in prison, and then also then maybe the 3 things that are working for people when they leave.
The one that I was quoted in the draft of saying, I was fairly specific about, and I have mentioned the driver's licences. It's about having some assistance with not being released without a Medicare card, or, I mean, they do okay. They do a letter that says, with a picture on it, you've just come out of prison. But I know people who have been, they thought they were only in for a few months, but then time lapsed, and then the driver's licence lapsed and whatever. So I think there needs to be some sort, and this could be done through corrective services. It doesn't, in fact, I've run into trouble trying to help people do it as a non-custodial person. To deal with things like that, having, not getting released with a brown bag or a garbage bag with your worldly possessions in it. I think one of the things that I saw working was being able to access parts of the prison where you could sit with somebody who was in real, many times I knew there were prisoners who were in the critical surveillance unit, but because of fear, the staff wouldn't let you in. I suppose fear for me. But the times that they did, it was always very positive. So that's one of the things that I suggested in the submission, that if we can get a professional enough, I suppose, aura, that we can be trusted, people who are not on the payroll can be trusted to sit beside people and to work out what their needs are.
Jenni, that probably leads then on to my next question. How do you get access to your clients or prisoners in there? How does a prisoner access a prison chaplain?
Well, it's varied over the years.
Has it?
And most of it's been a battle on behalf of the State Chaplaincy Board, because, I know one of the agents was not allowed to, he was fighting to get back into the common areas, in the actual, you can't go in a prisoner's cell, but into the common areas in the prison. And he was battling to get that back. And at the same time, up here in Townsville, we were being denied access to we were being told we couldn't go to the chapel, or the education block. We had to go to the accommodation areas and sit in the... So how do we get it?
Can any prisoner who wants to interact with a prison chaplain get access? Is it simply a matter of making a request, or is it not that simple?
It should be that simple, right. And it can be that simple.
Okay.
It all depends on the officers, and I think that's one thing that I did bring out in the submission I put out, that there are just some who make it difficult for all, and then we...
You're talking prison officers, correctional services?
Yes, that, or probation and parole are corrective services, but even police officers.
Right.
And it's just the society's attitude that, it's all a matter of what our attitude is, whether imprisonment is as punishment or whether it's for punishment. It depends on the, I suppose, the emotional health of the person going in to prison, the chaplain, but a lot more on the actual custodial officer about whether they're in a fear that if they lose control, if this chaplain comes in and actually is able to sit with someone and not have confrontation. I've felt almost sometimes there was stupidly a jealousy or something. I don't know.
Now you go in as it's a faith-based organisation. What about the people of other faiths or no faiths? How are they serviced or supported?
I don't know.
Okay.
All I know is that I spoke with many and listened to many women from other faiths,
Right.
or who had no faith.
Yeah.
They would see somebody else chatting to me, and they might come over and that's why I'm saying it needs to be a personal thing, and how you do that in such a strict environment is difficult. But I've seen it happen, and I've read about it.
Difficult but not impossible?
I don't think it's impossible, but it's. I guess my faith. I believe that I would just pray that my time in there would be productive. That God would allow whatever opportunities to listen to people who needed to be listened to, and that's how the State Chaplaincy Board operates. We are there on the weekdays for pastoral care, not to preach. And there was one lady who had a Buddhist background who was nearing the end of her time in prison here, and the officers, some of them were putting pressure on her to respond and take the Australian government's offer of clemency so that she could stay in Australia, and because she was really concerned if she went back home she would be executed, or her family there could be many issues. And she would come to the chapel after she'd finished work faithfully every week, and she said the officers say, "Why are you going over there? They're Christians. You're not Christian, you're Buddhist. Why don't you get help from the Buddhists?" And I said, well, as a matter of fact, we've got a DVD here from the Dalai Lama, and it's about making choices, and would you like to watch it? At that point, a couple of other women came into the chapel, and she started talking to them, and then in the end I said to her, well, do you want to watch this DVD? And we'd had conversations over the years before that, and we'd had the words, we knew why she was in there. She couldn't say no to some friends who asked her to bring a TV into Australia for her auntie. And she was telling me as she went along, I've stopped buying coffee because I can't say no. Now I've got more money to phone my family. So I showed her the DVD. I said, well, do you want to watch it? She said, no. See, I can say no.
We're going to
and it's that personal approach.
Thanks, Jenny.
I think we'll leave our questions there and move to the floor, and we may have time for one, maybe two comments from people in the audience today.
I'd like to make a comment.
Thank you. Please, your name and where you're from.
My name's Ed Spriggins. I'm just representing myself, but I'm also a prison chaplain here in Townsville. And just on the point of what we do inside the prison there is that we do have now access to all areas of the prison. There are some restrictions on you can't go into cells and a few other things like that, but access is pretty readily available for us, working within the system and their functions there. One of the things that has changed, I think, is that all the new recruits that go into the prison now, the chaplains actually have an opportunity to address the class. So we can actually explain to the officers there why we're there and what we do. And so it makes it a lot easier because, up until recently, the officers would see us going in there chatting and shaking hands with these people and getting involved with them, whereas when we walk out, they go back to what they were like previously before we went in a lot of cases. And the other thing too is that there isn't a lot of support for prisoners when they are released. And that's one of the biggest problems that I see, is that the fact that society wants to put people in prison for good reasons, but we admit that the system doesn't work, because when they come out, they're still classified as criminals. And until we sort of address that issue, we're not going to go very far with what turning the lives of these people around. And the other thing too is that there are, if you took out a lot of the druggies that are in the prisons there, we wouldn't have any overcrowding in there. And one of the big reasons in Townsville why we have a high prison population is that a lot of people that are in there have a very low vocabulary. So they have about less than 800 words or something like that. So they haven't the capacity to be able to negotiate their way through difficult situations without, it ending up in violence. Yep.
Thank you. That's useful.
And on that, in my submission, I did put that if prisoners do feel like they need to make some complaint or whatever, there's a blue letter system. But often they don't use it because, what Ed said, they don't have the literacy levels, or they don't trust the system, or other prisoners will see them putting them in, and there are just so many issues that we on the outside just don't know about.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Well done. Good on you.
There was one other thing with the what I specifically picked out of my submission about preparing for release. There does need to be, the system is in place with your transitions, but there's the problem with that. But there's also the attitude, once it's on your record, that seems to be a real problem for causing more recidivism. Many facilities, you have to, if you've got a long sentence, you have to have graduated for the last 6 months to a low security. Yeah. And there are some prisoners, in that low security, I'd like to advocate for, perhaps day release, to go with somebody to get these cards and so on. But Rowena Solomon tells us of many cases, which I know about, where prisoners just can't get to the low security to be released. They get released sometimes from the detention unit direct, because that's what the courts say they have to happen.
We've had that feedback from others, and I think your point's well made, and I think there are opportunities for us all to do better as a society in some of those areas.
The example that Rowena gives was someone who 20 years prior had attempted to escape. Yeah. It wasn't even a re-offence or anything.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny, for your years of experience being shared here today with the audience and Commissioner Wood and myself. And thank you once again for your submission as well that you sent into the inquiry.